Thank you for joining me for our study, the Lifeway study in the book of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. This is session 2. The title is Shared, and the text is 1st Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. The lesson summary statement is the gospel is to be boldly shared with compassion and grace. The way I'm going to start the lesson is when the members come to the class, I have this word search diagram for them, and I will give that to them, and as the class gathers and people come, they can be working on that. And then when it's time to start, I'll have prayer, and then we'll make reference to this search for a man like Paul. And there are 15 descriptions of Paul that are found in these verses. And it was a way to kind of begin to get them engaged in the text early in the lesson. And this lesson summary statement is worth spending a little bit of time on, I believe. First of all, the gospel. Many people can't concisely express the gospel. So I'm going to provide my class with a good gospel track and then just basically go through the basic points of that to make certain that we're clear what the gospel is. God loves us, sin separated us, Jesus provides forgiveness for our sins through the death and burial and resurrection, and our response is repentance and belief in Jesus. You can turn to the front of your teacher's quarterly and your students' quarterlies, and there is a gospel presentation there. You may want to find another track that is helpful in that, or you could take them through the Roman roads, but I think it's important to take some time to be certain that the class understands what is the gospel, what is the good news, because so many people really can't explain that concisely. The gospel is also a word that is filling the letter of 1 Thessalonians. The church is birthed by the gospel. The church is stabilized by the gospel. And so it's important that people in the class understand what we're talking about when we mention the gospel, because there's a wide range of understandings. Notice the lesson summary statement says the gospel is to be boldly shared. The word boldly there has about it the idea of fearless, daring spirit. Now, if Paul taught to protect himself from criticism or mistreatment, he certainly failed. When he went to Corinth, he was hauled before the authorities. He faced a mob in Ephesus. He was attacked in Jerusalem. He was imprisoned in Caesarea and in Rome. And finally, tradition says he was executed as a criminal. So if he was trying to avoid those things, he was a miserable failure. But if Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians and his other letters in order to protect the church and to protect the gospel, to set an example of what Christian ministry has looked like, and set a precedent for the ages to come, then he certainly was successful. Paul spoke boldly, and if there was anyone who could have been intimidated because of his experiences to be quiet about the gospel, it certainly would have been Paul. But the gospel is to be fearlessly and daringly shared with compassion and grace. The idea of compassion is that there's this sympathy, conscientious concern for others. But the word compassion is more than just sympathy and compassion. It is also coupled with the desire to alleviate that which is suffering. In Matthew chapter 9, verse 36, it says that when Jesus looked upon people, he saw them as he had compassion on them because he saw them harassed and helpless. And so there was something in the heart of Jesus that drew his great love for people apart from God, and he did something about it. And then it says that not only does the gospel need to be shared boldly, fearlessly, daringly, with compassion, a concern and a sympathy for others, a desire to do something about it, but it needs to be done in grace. And that is talking about the idea of being considerate and thoughtful and respectful of people when we're sharing the message of Christ. Now, Paul is defending himself in this chapter. He had to leave town, and you can learn about that in Acts chapter 17. He had to leave town after 3 synagogue services, and there was a riot. Wherever Paul went, he seemed to cause a riot. And apparently, from the things he's saying, we can discern what his enemies are saying about him. They're saying that he was just a huckster. He was a flim-flam man. He got what he wanted out of him, and then he skipped town. And they're using that to cause people to question the character of Paul. Now, Paul is concerned with the truth of the gospel. But if the gospel can be questioned because of the character of Paul, then the gospel will be harmed. So Paul is defending himself only for the sake of defending the gospel and the establishment of that church. Our first point in this lesson is persistent. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. For the gospel to be shared with compassion and grace, it will require persistence. The definition of persistence is to go on resolutely or stubbornly in spite of opposition, trouble, or warning. And so Paul is giving evidence that this is the way he went about sharing the gospel. Even when there was trouble, even when there was opposition, he was persistent in that. Now let's read the verses together. For you yourselves know, brothers and sisters, that our visit with you was not without result. Now this phrase, you yourselves, is an emphasis. And he's pointing to them and saying, you were witnesses of how I lived among you, that our visit was not without result. Now, he could be talking about the fact that the church was established and the church was persevering. He could also mean that I came with a purpose. I had an aim in which I was accomplishing, and that was accomplished. He goes on to say in verse 2, on the contrary, after we had previously suffered and were treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know, we were emboldened by our God to speak the gospel of God to you in spite of great opposition. So he speaks about openness, but he also speaks about his suffering. He was prepared to suffer for the gospel. You might want to have someone in the class read Acts 16, verse 16 to 24, and there it describes the suffering that Paul and Silas experienced at the hands of the Philippians after having preached the gospel and cast this demon out of this young woman that would follow behind them. They were beaten, they were jailed, they were stripped naked, the greatest kind of insult in the ancient world. And he says they were treated outrageously. And yet, that did not stop Paul. In fact, the power of God was so strong in Paul that what that actually did is that encouraged him. It emboldened him to speak the gospel to God. Despite the great opposition, it is our word agony. It was used to describe the athletic competition in the Olympics. And so Paul is describing here his persistence in the gospel. Where do Christians in our context encounter opposition to telling the gospel or living it? I've had people in our church tell me about the difficulties they have in living out their Christian faith because of political correctness in the workplace. And maybe some of your members will have stories about that, where it challenges their Christian faith. The Southern Baptist Convention is no longer working in cooperation with the Red Cross. The Red Cross would give food to the Southern Baptist feeding trailers. We fed about 80% of all the meals for the Red Cross in disasters. But the Red Cross began to say, you cannot receive this food and feed people if you're going to continue to try to tell people about the gospel, about how they can be saved. And so Southern Baptists have decided that we will no longer cooperate with the Red Cross because it is of paramount importance that we share the message of Jesus Christ. And so an entirely different way of organizing that has been provided through the local churches. But it's a situation of our day. Can you believe it? Here are people in great need, and yet here's an organization, instead of the concern of feeding the people, they want to tell people that they can't give them hope through the gospel message. Well, one of the things that we learn from Paul in his persistence is you can never underestimate the impact of a persistent, godly life. The world says that what we need is to have a very flamboyant, a very energetic, very high impact kind of message to get people's attention. But what we see in the life of Paul is the thing that God blesses and pours His power into are faithful Christians who continue to live out the Christian life and continue to share about Christ, and they simply don't give up. There is persistence. They go on resolutely and stubbornly in spite of opposition, trouble, or warning. The second point of our lesson is gentle. The apostle is to be bold, the gospel is to be boldly shared with compassion and grace. I have a question for the class. How do people who are hurt and wounded treat other people? And what I'm looking for there is people who've been hurt, people who are wounded. They're angry, they're impatient, they're harsh, they're critical, they're complaining, all kinds of things when someone has been deeply wounded and hurt. Now here is a man named Paul, and he has been deeply mistreated by others. He's trying to do good, and yet it seems as though everything's turning out bad. People are rioting over his message of faith in Jesus Christ. So you would have thought that when Paul arrived at Thessalonica, he would be spoiling for a fight, or he would be demanding his rights. But instead, what you find in the Apostle Paul is a man of humility, a man who's simply bringing the truth to the people, and he is working for the benefit of those in Thessalonica, not for his personal enrichment. Now notice how he says this in verses 3 through 7. In verse 3, it talks about how he refused to behave. For our exhortation, his teaching, didn't come from error or impurity or intent to deceive. His teaching didn't have false teaching in it. His teaching was delivered with purity of motive and purity of message, and there was no hook in it. There was no cover-up with his message. And now he talks about how he actually behaved, verses 4 through 7. Instead, just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please people, but rather God, who examines our hearts. For we never used flattering speech, as you know, or had greedy motives. God is our witness. And we didn't seek glory from people, either from you or from others. Although we could have been a burden as Christ's apostles, instead we were gentle among you as a nurse nurtures her own children. So how did he actually behave? There are three things I see in this passage that you might want to break out and speak to the class about. The first is his ministry was God-centered in verse 4. Instead, just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please people, but rather God, who examines our heart. Look what God does. He approves of Paul. He entrusted Paul with a message. He lives to please God, and it is God that tests his heart. It's God that examines his heart. Paul is saying, my whole purpose when I was there serving you is I was there. My ministry was centered on pleasing God and delivering the message of God and I was approved by God, and God examined my heart. Now that is freeing, when you don't have to live for the approval of people, when you know that your message is a message of grace and goodness and love. You're not trying to get something out of people. His was a God-centered ministry. Notice it was a God-pleasing ministry in verse 5, for we never used flattering speech. He said, my method was not that. Flattery is using words to gain favor with people. It's complimenting people for self-serving purposes. Paul said, that was not my method. And he said, you know this. When you think back to how I related to you and how I taught you, you know that I did not use flattery as my method. But notice also my motive, or had greedy motives. I didn't do these things for my own self-advancement and advantage. God is our witness. In fact, he's saying not just you witnessing, but God who actually sees motives. He said, God witnessed this. And we didn't seek glory from people, either from you or from others. Glory is a recognition of enhancement, or a recognition or enhancement of status. And Paul was not motivated for a desire for personal glory. There are three illicit ways that people use to build up themselves. There's flattery, there's greed, and there's a hunger for compliments. And Paul is saying that I didn't do that, and you are witnesses of that, and Paul and God is a witness of that. And then the last picture he uses is that of a mother with a new baby. See what he says? And it's a picture of self-sacrificing. His ministry was God-centered. He lived to please God. And then it was self-sacrificing love. Notice what he says in verse 7. Although we could have been a burden as Christ's apostle, instead we were gentle among you, as a nurse nurtures her own children. It's a picture of a mother with a newborn, and she's breastfeeding this child. And it's a beautiful picture of self-sacrifice. And so Paul uses these three pictures. And you can go into greater detail in explaining the words if that would be of value to your class. But these three pictures of how he behaved. He was God-centered, he was God-pleasing, and he was self-sacrificing. And then I'm going to ask the ladies this question. Ladies, how is the image of a mother with a newborn helpful in telling others the gospel? How is it helpful when it comes to ministering to people in our community and people in the church? What can we learn from this picture that Paul has given us? Is it child-centered? Is it child-pleasing? It certainly is self-sacrificing. Those are the things that I'm going to be looking for in our discussion. For Paul uses these pictures to say, I was gentle with people. Now, the third point that he has in this lesson is the fact that he was blameless. Verses 8 to 12. The gospel is to be boldly shared with compassion and grace. I want you to notice some things about this text. Notice, first of all, his evangelistic method in verses 8 and 9. His evangelistic method. And then verse 10 to 12, notice his pastoral method. First of all, he was blameless in his evangelistic method. We cared so much for you that we were pleased to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become dear to us. This word care is the only place where this word is used in the New Testament. It's rare in other Greek writings of that day. And they find the term to be a place of affection that was used in nurseries. And so apparently the word has about it this unselfish giving of yourself. So he's using a strong word. The word cared is not strong enough, but it's the word that you find in the nursery where a mother is caring for a baby. He said that's how he cared for them. And he had this message. God gave him a message that he shared with them. And then he says also he was a hard worker in verse 9. For you remember our labor and hardship, brothers and sisters, working night and day. And here's the reason, so that we would not be a burden to any of you. We preached God's gospel to you. Paul went into the communities, and oftentimes the traveling teachers would come in and they would gather up and they would charge a fee, and then after a certain time they would move on to someplace else. Well, Paul didn't do that. He didn't want them to think that he was selling the gospel. And it was a circumstance where he found a way to make a living. And we know that Paul was a tent maker, and that could have been like a camping tent, or the shawl that Jewish men wore over their head was also called a tent. And so it could be that Paul made these prayer shawls. The word that was used for them, were made up of two words, a tent and a covering. And so when they would put that over their head, they would say they were in their small tent. So Paul could have been making shawls for that, or he could have been making tents for when they would live outdoors. Whatever the point, whatever his work was, he provided for himself and for Silas and Timothy so that the people didn't have to pay for him. Now, Paul wasn't against getting paid. While he was there, he received income from the church at Philippi. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 4 to 14, he talks about compensating pastors in the ministry as well. But he did this so that he would be blameless in terms of presenting the gospel. And notice, that is his evangelistic method. He cared, he shared the message, and he worked hard. Serving people is some of the hardest work there is to do. I came across a statistic that those who serve as EMTs, the average tenure for an EMT is 18 months. And 60% will quit. After 10 years, there's almost 100% number of people who have quit in terms of EMTs. We've been hearing about the burnout of people in the medical profession with the pandemic. And so one of the things that is difficult is when you're serving people. We see that in medicine, we see that in education, we see it in counseling. It is hard work. So Paul was evangelistic in his caring for people, in his message, and in working hard. But notice also his pastoral method, and that's verses 10 through 12. And basically what I'm wanting to do in those passages is to show that Paul goes back to another parental metaphor, that of a father. And basically in those two passages, what I want you to see is in verse 10, he talks about instruction, and an example. He provided an example for them. And then in verse 11 and 12, he talks about instruction. And that is the role of a father, particularly in that first day, in that first century. A father was responsible for the education and future of his sons. And so in order for his son to be prepared to live successfully, the father would give clear direction to how he was to be trained and how he was to be educated. And Paul's picking up on that picture to say that when it came to him relating to them, he provided those kinds of things. There are three things I'd want you to notice that he says here about his pastoral method in verses 10 through 12. There is a consistent witness, that's verse 10, and then there's the challenging instructor, that's verse 11 and 12. That's the father image. And then there is an objective that he wants to accomplish. He knows exactly what he's wanting to accomplish with these believers. And that is, he wants them to walk worthy of God. So there's much in this passage in terms of things that you could bring out in your studies. Let me just mention a couple of them. Where it says here, he implored each one of you. That is individually. Paul is saying, you know that I spent time with each one of you, seeking to help you grow in your relationship. I'm going to ask the men this question. Men, how does the image of a father lead us to minister in an effective way when it comes to sharing the gospel and growing Christians in the gospel? And you may want to hold off on some of the explanation of this passage as the men respond and give you answers. Then you may want to go into deeper explanations of some of the words and the phrases that are here that you discover from your study. For example, encouraged. A father, he urged them towards a positive behavior. He comforted them, helping them to deal with difficulties, depressions or disappointments in life. They always have failures in life. And Paul said, like a father was there to comfort you, or implored them. He challenged them to live up to their potential. Now, to close the lesson, the Explore the Bible has a recommendation of an article about the Ukrainian Baptist Seminary in Ukraine. And then it'll lead you to a news report on the Christianity Today article. And I'm going to share with them this article, and it's about, the title is Ukrainian Seminary Leader, Russian Invasion Could Send Baptist Churches Underground. And the article is about how they'll respond to persecution and how God has affected and helped to seek the gospel, send the gospel forth when there's been persecution. And then I want to have them turn to page 27, where there are the summary statements. And I'm going to ask one person if they would pray the first summary statement for the Ukrainian Baptist and pray that for us. And then the second summary statement, I'm going to ask somebody if they'll pray for the Ukrainian Baptist as well as for us. And then the third summary statement, ask someone to take that statement and in light of that statement, offer a prayer for these dear people who are suffering so in Ukraine, as well as praying for us. In other words, I'm trying to reinforce this idea that the gospel is to be boldly shared with compassion and grace. God bless you for teaching God's Word.